Time for business. We say hello to Yuka Royer.
Hi, François.
We begin with the EU making good on the raising of tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles.
That's right. Starting Friday, provisional tariffs will be imposed on EVs made in China coming into the EU on top of the standard 10% tariff on imported cars. The rate slightly tweaked from the initial proposal last month. It ranged from 17.4% to 37.6%. Western car makers like Tesla and BMW will also be subject to 20.8% tariffs. They'll remain provisional for 4 months as the two sides continue talks to try and find a solution. Here's a spokesperson from the European Commission.
The introduction of tariffs is not an objective per se. It is a means to correct an imbalance, an unfair competitive situation to the detriment of producers of electric vehicles in the EU compared to those who are producing vehicles in China.
Well, the European Commission has long argued that heavily subsidized Chinese cars are flooding international markets and hurting competition, a charge Beijing denies. China is the world's largest exporter of passenger cars, overtaking Japan last year, and about a quarter of its vehicle exports last year were electric. The volume grew from less than 200,000 units back in 2020 to about 1.5 million in 2023. More than half of that went to Europe, including countries outside of the European Union.
So who's going to pay for these tariffs?
That's the million-dollar question when it comes to trade battles, isn't it? The former US President Donald Trump has repeatedly vowed to make China pay, but is that the case? Well, in reality, it will most likely be consumers who are left to foot the bill, unless car makers are willing to absorb the cost and reduce their prices to offset it. Chinese brands MG and NIO suggested they might increase prices in Europe later this year, and Tesla has already said it will do so. Volkswagen has reacted angrily to the new tariffs, as German car makers stand to lose the most, as one analyst explains.
There's really no winners in this clash, right? But if we talked about who loses more, I'd say it's actually these European automakers, specifically the Germans and the premium ones, because they are producing in China and exporting some of those models, as you mentioned, back to Europe, while at the same time, they're facing a downturn in market share in China.
Well, China maintains it will take all necessary measures to defend its interests, which could include retaliatory tariffs on European cars, but also on other products such as pork and cognac. But Beijing also knows the support within the EU is wavering on the EU EV tariffs. Its Commerce Ministry reacted calmly, saying that it hoped ongoing talks would lead to a positive outcome during the 4-month window.
中方注意到
China has noticed that the governments of some EU member states and major automobile companies have repeatedly expressed their opposition to the EU's implementation of countervailing measures against Chinese electric vehicles. China hopes that the EU will listen carefully to the internal voices.
Yeah, and China is also expanding with factories outside the mainland.
Yeah, interestingly, just this Thursday, BYD opened a factory in Thailand, its first EV plant in Southeast Asia. As Tom Canetti explains, it's part of a wider push into the fast-growing regional market and beyond.
BYD's first factory in Southeast Asia, a growing regional market for electric vehicles, where the Chinese company has become a dominant player, and the Thai government has pledged to convert 30% of annual vehicle production to electric by 2030. The factory has an annual production capacity of 150,000 vehicles and will provide over 10,000 jobs after reaching full capacity.
We are convinced that Thailand will have a golden development period for new energy vehicles. China and Thailand are geographically close, culturally close, and economic and trade cooperation is booming. New energy vehicles are not only a bridge between China and Thailand to enhance friendship, but also a link between BYD and Thailand.
The opening forms part of a broader concentration by Chinese electric vehicle producers towards the global south, as the EU and the US has moved to impose import tariffs and tighter conditions. BYD now has over 30 industrial parks and production bases worldwide, with a total area of over 18 million square metres. Outside of China, it has factories in Japan, Hungary, India and Brazil. The export of cheaper Chinese electric vehicles has increased drastically in Latin America, particularly in countries like Brazil and Mexico. In Brazil, for example, BYD is the biggest seller of electric vehicles, claiming about 70% of the market.